Hello everyone and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD. Today we're going to be going over the top 20 worst albums of 2024. There's quite a lot to get into as far as bad music goes in 2024, as there was quite a bit to get into with good music, and there will be once I get to the best list, even more good to talk about, but we gotta rip the band-aid off and do this one real quick here. Unfortunately, some of them can't fully make the list because they're EPs, even if they might look like albums. Some of them do just look like EPs, but really should have made the cut anyways. So we're gonna go ahead and do a top 5 worst EPs before the video even fully begins here and we get into the list, just to kind of quickly get them out of the way so they don't have a noticeable lack of presence on the list. At number 5 here, we have the Chainsmokers with No Hard Feelings. This is aesthetically and sonically very similar to what they already did the year prior on their full album that basically looked just like this one. But this is continuing and maybe even worsening their already very generic and boring sounds. It's hard to really remember anything at all from this project if I'm not actively listening to it right now. It kind of feels like they've fallen off, but they were never really all that on to begin with. At number 4, we have JoJo Siwa with Guilty Pleasure, her EP that of course had Karma on it, and that was kind of a viral but very negative moment. Generally, everything around this EP and her music in 2024 as a whole has been exactly that. Truthfully, the thing doesn't actually sound that terrible, at least not as bad as people would have you believe, but that's mostly just due to it being a bunch of songs that she purchased. For most of these, you can literally look up original version of the song and hear someone else singing it. I'm not sure if it's the case for every song or not, but either way, they all have like 17 writers or something crazy like that on them, and one of them is Meghan Trainor, just quick shout out there. Some of the songs would be bad without the surrounding moment that this whole thing was, but for the most part this is just really bland, mediocre, and the artist who's claiming the songs didn't even actually make them.
I like cheating. I like hurry up.
At number 3, we have Kim Petras, Slut Pop Miami, definitely the funniest of the projects that we'll be talking about today, so at least I can give it some points there for some sort of enjoyment level, but it's just like really obnoxiously sexual, and not in a fun way, not even really in a fully humorous way, in a way where you have to wonder why anybody would be saying the type that is in the lyrics here. It also just sounds like club music from 2010 or thereabouts. Sonically speaking, I wouldn't be surprised to hear something like that on the radio around that time, but lyrically speaking, it's certainly not getting onto any radios. And number 2, we have Motley Crue Cancelled, a 3-track EP, one of the 3 tracks being a pretty terrible cover, and the other 2 just being butt rock generic bullshit that's been clogging up the entire rock genre for the last god knows how long. Coming at us from a band that at one point had a decent bit of respect, although not that much, but at this point they've certainly taken on the whole old man yells at cloud type approach about cancel culture in ways that don't even really exist, but very tasteless and hard to stomach sorts of ways. At number 1 for the EPs here, we have MGK and Trippie Redd with Genre, Space, Space, Sad Boy. Probably the worst title of the year and the worst EP of the year, as this sees the two of them sucking all of the life, creativity, and soul out of emo rap that it once had, even despite being a pretty widely criticized genre, with almost all of the popular artists who made the genre a thing, or at least made it popular in the first place, literally not being here to keep making music within it. This is kind of just what we're left with is MGK and Trippie Redd, and Trippie Redd has put out good music in the past, so this just makes that look worse now. The fact that this exists is just depressing, and it sees them boiling emo rap down to the worst possible, most soulless place it could ever go. The lyrics are cringe, the production is mediocre at its best points and really grating at its worst points, and there's nothing new or interesting to be heard across it. Alright, so then we're gonna move on to the actual list here at number 20.
Fuck blind people and deaf people suck. So do cripples, dumb quadriplegic fucks.
In a sense of the quality of the music itself, Death of Slim Shady is probably the best sounding album on this list. The album mostly makes the list for just simply being a depressing thing to look at and acknowledge the existence of. Eminem's career has been somewhat akin to a really nice, high quality loaf of bread. At one point really considered one of the best, putting out projects like the Slim Shady LP and the Marshall Mathers LP. But as has been acknowledged time and time again by various people, that career has gotten pretty moldy. While 2020's Music to Be Murdered By saw a flash in the pan moment of improvement, not up to his former glory by any means, but improvement, it's just right back down the shitter with this one. If Kamikaze was a concept album about being mad that he's perceived to have fallen off, then Death of Slim Shady is a concept album about being mad that anyone has ever taken any issue with any of his lyrics ever in the past, even when it's pretty clear why one might. There's very little impact to anything that he says, given the whole narrative about being cancelled, and it just comes across as cheap rage bait most of the time. If that wasn't bad enough, it does a decent bit to paint a negative light over the once untarnished classics in his discography. He easily could have just let the Slim Shady character die, as he did for many years at this point, but nah, I had to dust it off and make it worse, I guess. Then moving on to number 19. Here we have 6 Feet Under, Killing for Revenge. Ever since vocalist Chris Barnes years ago departed from Cannibal Corpse and started 6 Feet Under, the band has been criticized as one of the worst in death metal. The Nickelback of death metal is back at us once again with Killing for Revenge, and it's just another instance of why they're so mid. Almost all of what you'll find here, even down to the lyrics, is completely boilerplate death metal, just lacking any of the real impressive elements that are usually there. It's poorly mixed, instrumentally unimpressive, and the vocal tone is particularly grating. The one lyrical standout across the whole thing is, journalists ignore their pleas, kill them all without mercy, internet trolls shot in the face so they can't spread any more hate. Which reads as blatantly ironic considering that is in and of itself spreading hate, but also just reads as them being bitter that they're talked about negatively from publications and from people on the internet. It's just such an ugly look. Maybe if they were to focus a little bit more on creating good or interesting music instead of putting a terrible Hair of the Dog cover at the end of their album, people would be talking a bit more positively about the music. And then we move on to number 18. Here we have Imagine Dragons' Loom. While this opinion might not be all too widely shared, I think Imagine Dragons showed a decent bit of potential on their Mercury Act 1 project a couple of years back. I've always found that in a popularity sense, Imagine Dragons is obviously quite overrated, but in the online discourse space, I think they're grouped in with the worst of the worst a bit unfairly. But all of that hope of a good band being buried in there somewhere is right out the window from me with the release of Loom. Here you'll find sounds that would have felt outdated on their 2012 debut, some of the most lame, generic, and mediocre lyrics possible, a complete lack of heart, passion, or soul in any of it, and seemingly a desperate desire to land on TV commercials. Then moving on to number 17. Here we have Sheer Mag, Playing Favorites. This is probably my most controversial take on the list, but hopefully the sounds that you heard in the clip before this segment let you know why exactly this is here. This album reads to me entirely like a reminder that critics probably shouldn't be trusted. I am shocked that a 5 out of 10 is the lowest score I could find on this from a critic. I can't say that I'm all too fond of the bass aesthetic and approach with this one, as it's essentially just a stereotypical indie rock album. That's far from the issue though, because the vocals alone make this album a complete non-starter for me. I have to feel bad absolutely hating a vocalist performance like this, but I have to draw the line somewhere. I'm surprised this isn't more widely disliked because I truly hear a rock version of Tones and I. To make matters worse, the way this album was mixed and produced is particularly bad. It might be an aesthetic choice like it was with the Bill Ryder Jones album that I also disliked quite a bit earlier this year, but either way, it just makes the album more annoying and adds to the ear fatigue of it. How much of it was intentional or not, I have no idea, but this is nails on a chalkboard to me at most points. At number 16 now. Here we have Wage War with their album Stigma. I know we already had 6 Feet Under here, but what's worse than death metal taken to its worst logical conclusion? Wage War answers that question by being deathcore and metalcore taken to its worst logical conclusion. I have to give it to them in that some songs here, such as Tombstone, are just a mediocre samey rendition of what's already common within the genre. It gets so much worse anytime they try to experiment a little bit more though. The electronic elements of this album are absurd. There's also the vocalist occasionally doing what I can only describe as his best impression of Corpse Husband. Then to wrap it all up and tie it in a nice little bow, it randomly becomes a country album for about 30 seconds. If the band here was just playing to the genre's tropes, this album probably would have just gone completely under my radar. Those goofy, misguided little changes are what gets it this high up on the list. Then moving on to number 16. Here we have Lil Uzi Vert, Eternal A Take 2. Uzi is the first of 2 artists we'll see here showcasing the detriments to the human mind nitrous causes. I've always found Lil Uzi to be an artist that I liked a little bit more than the consensus, and their recent Pink tape wasn't a bad project overall. What we see here on the sequel to one of their better projects is a genuinely shocking and confusing fall off. There are songs towards the back end of this project that are acceptable, but inevitably uninteresting pop trap songs, and the first half is certainly a lot to take in. Meteor Man was already on my worst songs list for wildly inconsistent pacing, failed experimentation, and downright laughable lyrics. It doesn't get much better from there with Pars and the Mars and The Rush. The latter of the two having an actual big time Rush feature of all things, which boils down to them just saying a couple of words in the beginning of the song and that's it. This isn't the worst album of the year, but it's certainly the most confusing. At number 14 we have
My superpower was ADHD.
Paris Hilton, Infinite Icon. Pop music saw its highest highs and lowest lows in many years in 2024, and Paris Hilton's album here is the first of the extremely low lows that we're going to bring up. This one lands so low compared to some others because it's simply just hard to say anything about it. That said, lack of anything to say is pretty much the biggest issue with it. Paris Hilton here is just diving back into music for the sake of profit, I have to imagine. Every song on Infinite Icon sounds like something you've heard a million times before if you were alive for the last 2 decades. Unlike most generic instances of this flavor of dance pop we saw in the 2000s, you don't have the main backing talents to bring up any of the life and mass appeal those songs had. The best Infinite Icon can manage is literally slapping an entire Sia song on the album where Paris Hilton herself is listed as a feature. There's nothing of taste or substance on this album, and it's a blandness that reminds me of why I wasn't a poptimist at all in my younger years. This just reminds me of what used to be popular, but in none of the good, refreshing, or nostalgic ways that an album like Brat did earlier this year. Then we'll move on to number 13.
When I was a kid, I would go to McDonald's. I would never order the small. I would get it big.
Here at the spot we have Usher, Coming Home. This entry is pretty much just another example of someone shooting far too wide in the scope of mainstream appeal and ending up making an album that sounds like nothing. It's overblown, it's aesthetically tacky in general, and there's just none of the fun that often comes with pop music. Oddly, it's quite dated upon impact here. This feels stuck in the past, which is especially sad given how well some of Usher's previous music has aged from as back as far as the 90s, really. It's a very long album, clocking in at 66 minutes, and if almost nothing interesting comes across through that runtime, it becomes a bit torturous. The only memorable moments on this album are the extremely stupid ones, such as the track Big, which I already talked about in my worst songs list. This doesn't crack the top 10 because at least some of it had some funny bad in there. Overall though, those flash in the pan moments don't save it from being a mostly irredeemable listen. Then we move on to number 12. Here at this placement, we have 143 by Katy Perry. First, Katy Perry fell off in 2017 with Witness. Next, Katy Perry fell off in 2020 with Smile. Finally, she's fallen off in 2024 in the biggest way yet with 143. So much so that it's hard to imagine this is an artist that ever had a dedicated fan base. First, we had the release of Woman's World, the lead single here, where she made a song arguably ripping off the aesthetics of Arca, and in collaboration with Dr. Luke, again, for some reason. With lyrics so vague, inoffensive, and borderline parody, they could never dream of achieving the political and social statement they seemingly set out for. For the most part, this album follows suit with its lead single by being terribly generic, just vague pop music slop. It's when you get to some of the worst lyrical moments or head-scratching collaborations that it gets to its worst spot. I've already talked about the 21 Savage feature collab on my worst songs list. Ultimately, their chemistry paired with some truly terrible lyrics makes for something laughably bad. Later on the album, we have a JID feature, and at this point, I'm confused as to why he's appearing on shit that he's appearing on. You could probably write a book about how bad this moment was for Katy Perry, but we'll just stop there. At number 11, it's Camila Cabello, C,XOXO. This album has only a tiny gap in quality from the one before it for being pretty much the same thing. The main difference is that instead of feeling like a gross and generic version of early 2010s pop revival, this one feels like a gross and generic version of the current hyperpop wave while having none of the fun energy. It's hard to say how deep the inspiration runs, given that I imagine this was in development for a while, but it does bear a striking resemblance to Brat, which came a couple months before it, and I have to feel like it was riding that wave at least a little bit. Where this album edges out 143 is that the guest features on it are even worse. Here we have Playboy Carti stumbling his way over a hyperpop instrumental, BLP Kosher literally just glazing on an interlude for no reason, and worst of all, not one, but two Drake features, one of which being literally just a Drake song. Camila is not even credited on it, and this was immediately following the Kendrick Lamar beef. At least Lil Nas X does alright though, I guess. That then takes us into number 10.
Oh, it's holiday season.
And here we have Ian's Valedictorian. Ian has been very widely talked about this year, often in a pretty negative light, and if it weren't for his controversial persona, his music probably would have gone completely under the radar due to a lack of substance. Ian has been commonly criticized for essentially gentrifying the flows, lyrics, and delivery of artists like Future and Gucci Mane, but realistically, I think it kind of goes farther down the pipeline than that, because Yeet is obviously inspired to some degree by those artists, and it feels like Ian is just trying to copy Yeet. The songs on this album are coming in, checking the boxes, and leaving. There's hardly even proper song structures. The whole project even feels like it closes mid-song, just unceremoniously cutting off at a certain point, making the whole thing feel so rushed and half-hearted. The mixing and production on this project are also fucking abominable compared to any of the contemporaries he's going up against who are popular. It really sounds like he got the stems for basic trap type beats from YouTube, fucked up all the levels, and then wrapped his verses into a webcam before sending them out. The only slightly notable things about Valedictorian are the places it's lacking compared to other albums like it. When you have nothing to talk about in the music itself, it's pretty clear that Ian has been strictly made popular based on the painfully white and suburban image he has. At least it's short, clocking in at about 20 minutes, but that's 20 of the most mind-numbingly bland minutes in music I've heard all year. We can then move on to number 9. Here we have Destroy Lonely, Love Lasts Forever. This is another album that mostly gets its placement based on being uninteresting for an astronomically long amount of time. That live performance where Cardi had Destroy Lonely and Ken Carson in a cage below him on stage has never felt more fitting. Destroy Lonely is truly his minion here, just trying and failing to recreate rage music that's anywhere near as captivating and unique. There's only 2 features here, and they come from Lil Uzi Vert, who's not really doing anything special, and Ken Carson, who's just a slightly better version of the same guy. The production here is mostly handled by Lil 88 and Wheezy to make matters worse. I understand Wheezy especially has been behind some big and notable stuff, but I truly fail to understand why he or Lil 88 have gotten the success they have gotten. That means that you get 64 almost uninterrupted minutes of Destroy Lonely attempting to not be the most mediocre rapper alive. That takes us into our number 8 spot. Here we have French Montana with Mac and Cheese 5. He really thought that name was clever enough to use it 5 times. Wild. If anyone has Destroy Lonely beat for the most mediocre rapper alive, it's French Montana. The issue is it's sort of flipped on its head here, because instead of there being way too much Destroy Lonely on Destroy Lonely's album, I feel like French Montana hardly has a presence on Mac and Cheese 5. There are features on almost every song, and the ones that don't have features are usually quite short. What's worse is that the features almost always sound more significant and notable than French Montana himself on his own music. There are some that sound okay, but I'd be far from coming back to those songs intentionally. The worst ones really jump out, however. It's hard to even fathom what the fuck happened with Stand United. When there's actually something interesting to say about French Montana, it's predictably for the wrong reasons. I literally laughed out loud when he opened a song with the line, "Even on your worst days, half decent." Like, damn, girl, you look just okay. The first song, Dirty Bronx intro, totally fails at being an intro track by being an entire 3 minutes and containing a switch so rough it's basically 2 songs smashed into one. The entire first minute or so is led by Amber Run and is essentially just a pop song if you put French Montana's ridiculous sounding ad-libs behind it. It's like they heard The Call by Shoo Shoo and somehow found a way to make it uninteresting. It then transitions into a pretty normal sounding rap section where he's essentially just coping about his lackluster career trajectory in an imaginary conversation like you'd have in the shower days after the actual conversation happened. Being the least interesting person of 2 or more people on a song is pretty much what French Montana's career is built upon. This project is just another full hour of that being the case. But if you're somehow hungry for more mac and cheese after this helping, he's went on to release a sped up version, a slowed down version, an a cappella version, an instrumental version, and of course, a deluxe release with extra songs, all of which being equally as mediocre as the songs on the original version of the album. As if it wasn't clear enough, he's really spelled it out that this project was just meant to farm streams. And then we move on to our number 7 pick.
The only thing you really need is a husband.
I feel like a Kanye West appearance was probably quite obligatory for this list, and I decided to go with the Vultures 2 album he did, of course, in collaboration with Ty Dolla $ign under the yen dollar sign collaboration name thing. Kanye certainly had a pretty rough run this decade, and with this most recent release here, it just gets worse. Whether it's giving his worst ever performances through AI or in person, gone is the Kanye that so many people came to know and appreciate through the years. The writing here is substanceless at best, gross at worst, but isn't even the main thing you'll be paying attention to. Instead, it's just how badly produced and put together the whole thing is. Here you have songs like Husband, which feel like a few minutes of Kanye just rambling over a completely unexciting beat, and on the other side of that, you have songs that sound obnoxiously bad, like Bomb. A song that originally only had Kanye's children performing on it, but now has Miles coming in to babysit. It should tell you a lot that Miles doesn't sound the slightest bit out of place, despite his whole persona being essentially a big, intentionally bad, ironic joke. I haven't even mentioned mention the other half of the duo here, Ty Dolla $ign, and that's because there's simply nothing to say. Even the collaboration itself is pretty pointless because one half has very little to even contribute. It says a lot when your main collaborator is just the guy you can pay to appear on almost anything. At least he sounds okay sometimes though, which is usually better than Kanye can manage on this project, and some of the collaborators do as well, which is why this isn't in the worst spot or even very close to it. That moves us on to our number 6 spot.
He never needed city lights from a small town called Sereno.
Here we have Tones and I, Beautifully Ordinary. Tones and I has become infamous in the music discussions space for some time now for just having some of the worst vocals. That came to full fruition back in 2021 with the Welcome to the Madhouse project that's also infamously hated, and for good reason. At least with that album, I can gather some funny bad type aspects where Beautifully Ordinary is just painfully boring through and through. The instrumentals here sound like the musical equivalent of a Hallmark card, which is technically an improvement, but not one I can laugh at. The one space there's been very little, if any, improvement on a technical level at all is the vocals. Essentially here you have over an hour of Tones and I vocals you've come to know and love, but now supplemented by the most fake, boring, sickeningly sweet instrumentals imaginable. It's not a straight 0 or anything because obviously there's technical improvements and some impressive instrumentation, I guess, to that degree, but it's so difficult to sit through the whole thing. Then we're gonna crack into our top 5 here with number 5.
Somebody pour me a drink, somebody bum me a smoke. I'm about to get on a buzz.
Here we have Post Malone, F1 Trillion. Of modern popular music, it seems like country is the most widely disliked at the moment. There's very good reason for that, and I don't think it's due to the decent folk and rock influences that made the genre come to be originally. It's more the shitty, sloppy, generic paint-by-numbers approach the biggest voices in the genre have put out. Despite all that, with its audience, it sells really well and does numbers. It seems Post Malone saw the possibility for profit there and decided to jump at that opportunity. The entire beginning portion of his career now looks like he simply used hip-hop as a stepping stone though. It totally takes away from anything good you could have said about the better albums he's made, especially given the low-key but noticeably distasteful sentiments that he seems to be delivering at a lot of moments on this album. There's very little to be liked about the boring blend of pop country that F1 Trillion takes up. The very little you might want to find about it that's positive gets completely overshadowed by how fake it makes Post Malone and his entire career. That then moves us on to our number 4 spot.
Digging like a caveman in a pussy for it. Even if you find it in there, what's the difference, baby? Semen probably already leaking and it's swimming in you.
Here we have Lil Dicky, Peanut. Lil Dicky is probably the most successful and popular artist whose main genre would be considered comedy rap. With the exception of lyrical genius Uno Miles, comedy rap is a genre that just keeps getting more and more annoying as the years pass. To match, Lil Dicky has also just gotten more and more annoying as the years pass. And Peanut has got to be the farthest peak he's pushed that to other than maybe singles like Earth. This album is a soundtrack to his television show Dave, and all it shows me is that the show is probably completely unfunny. Song topics here include everything from not wanting to eat fruits and vegetables to premature ejaculation, to SA in prison. It's actually obnoxious how there's 22 songs here, each attempting to be funny, yet never once getting a laugh out of me. Lil Dicky is a proficient rapper at best, but his tone and delivery is strikingly corny as a whole. The production he's over here ranges from mid to bad, so there's nothing really to do the heavy lifting. What that leaves us with is a 66-minute long joke that has no punchline and deserves to be met with pity laughs at best. At number 3 now. Here we have Lil Mabu, Young Genius. To go off the same sentiment, Lil Mabu is essentially what happens when comedy rap takes itself seriously and doesn't even try to be funny, because this whole album is essentially just making a mockery of drill music, while proudly embracing essentially just being a rich white kid that doesn't have any of the lived experience at all. He goes so far on here as to essentially do a drill parody of Daniel Powter's Bad Day, so if he's not making a mockery of the genre by doing his normal sound, then you could say he does does so in a more literal sense. There's distasteful lyrics all over this. I already mentioned Like a Cop, which was probably the worst offender, but the worst sounding song is Big Dog Shit, which features literally a 9-year-old on the hook. To make matters worse, he appears on the track immediately after Mabu says, "I fuck your bitch raw." So that rubs me the wrong way slightly, but maybe that's just me. There's only one song on here titled Big Dog Shit, but as far as I'm concerned, you might as well have just removed the space in the title and called the whole album that. Of this phenomena of rich white suburban kids using that as their gimmick to have a successful rap career, Lil Mabu has gotta be the most annoying one. At one point, he completely unironically lays down the line, "Should I have put down the mic and maybe taken up lacrosse?" And to put it as bluntly as possible, yes. Please, dear God, yes. Do that. Lacrosse court feels like the logical, natural habitat for someone like Mabu, but I don't care where it is as long as it's far away from a microphone. That brings us to our number 2 spot. Here we have Falling in Reverse, Popular Monster. While Ronald here plastered his own mugshot on this album for his own domestic abuse arrest, he actually never ended up serving much time for it. In 2024, he hasn't had the same luck avoiding bad music jail. That's not to say this album, and more broadly Falling in Reverse as a whole, are without their fans. Somehow. But on internet music discourse, this is already one of the most clowned on albums of all time, quite possibly. And that album cover is just the start of why that's the case. Other than maybe previous Falling in Reverse albums such as Fashionably Late, the detrimental long-term effects of nu metal have never been so evident. Whether he's taking on the same audible presence as a YouTube lyrical miracle type rapper or poorly imitating anything that makes metalcore good, this album is a rap metal fusion being pushed to the worst place it's ever been. As if the poor choice of aesthetics and poor execution of them wasn't enough, Ronald himself makes the album meet its true, full, terrible potential. The lyrics on this album are almost exclusively intertwined with his negative image, and it seems like with each entry on his laundry list of crimes and controversies, he leveled up another level in cringe factor. Being legitimately 40 years old, delivering the line, "My doctor tries to tell me that I'm going through a phase. Yeah, it's not a fucking phase," should feel so incredibly humiliating, but instead he delivers lines like that with full, unironic confidence. Then there's tracks like Zombified, where he attempts to take down cancel culture in some of the most ridiculous sounding ways, mirroring his already dumb as hell political statements. I already talked about Bad Guy in the worst songs list, but it's seriously so funny to me that there's a song that reads like he's just saying he's a bad person, just outright telling you he's a piece of shit, and then having a vocal feature on it to just say the same thing. It's obviously supposed to be satirical or sarcastic, but on paper, that's all it is. That does happen to be the most tolerable vocal feature though, considering the other ones are Jelly Roll, Alex Terrible of Slaughter to Prevail, and Tech 9. This album is truly a nightmare blunt rotation. There's more to be said, but it's all been said by someone else already a long time ago, many times. I'm truly hoping it takes at least another 7-year gap before I'm jump scared by Ronald's blank stare fucking up the new releases page, so I don't feel obligated to talk about him for a very long time. And then finally, that takes us into our number 1 spot. Here we have Jaydes, Count Up Dracula. Falling in Reverse was in the top spot on this list for the entire year since it dropped, but recently I stumbled upon this album. And not only is it my pick for worst album of the year, it is my pick for worst album I've ever heard. And that's brought to us by Florida-based, previous SoundCloud rapper, now pop punk artist, Jaydes. Almost every example of a rapper going punk or rock with their sound has amounted to some of the worst music of whatever time it dropped. At least artists like Kid Cudi had some existing talent and skill, and artists like MGK had major label associations and budget. Count Up Dracula is what happens when a rapper has none of those boosts that are obviously necessary, and yet still tries to take the plunge into near certain demise that is transitioning into punk as a rapper. Truly everything that could go wrong with a punk album happens here, making for one of the worst abominations my ears have ever had the displeasure of sitting through. Compared to others, I suppose percussion and bass are a particularly big thing to me, so we can start there. At least we could, but the bass is non-existent entirely. The drums here, however, make me wish I could say the same thing, as it sounds like we have here a post-lobotomy Travis Barker being recorded with a mic outside the building that he's playing in. The guitar tones seem to be aiming for gritty and raw, but only really achieve shrill and aggravating, and holy fucking shit, these are certainly the worst vocals I've heard on this type of music, and probably just the worst vocals I've heard anywhere. Trippie Redd's transition into pop punk was already one that was pretty rough, and I guess that's the most comparable thing I can think of, but even that comparison feels offensive. Jaydes' voice here more sounds like Trippie Redd with alcohol poisoning, dying of thirst while doing his best Kurt Cobain impression. While said Nirvana influence feels obvious, and of course a Dead Kennedy's influence is obvious, really take your pick for also adding in any similar and poppier band to the mix, such as Blink-182. Every song sounds like he's doing an intentionally bad parody of any of those bands or any other mainstream punk band. Somehow, all that said, the lyrics here are predictably even worse. It's almost always just on some preteen angst level pop punk bullshit, which is pretty expected, but occasionally slips into some cheap, tacky shock value. Or at least you would think it would be shock value, but the opening line on the album, "Killed my girlfriend and it felt so good. I opened her body up and I ate her guts," strikes a shocking resemblance to what he actually tried to do. Thankfully and fortunately, it's only what he tried to do and not achieved, because apparently he's just as good at music as he is at committing homicide. I seriously had no idea about any of this when I went into this album, but wow, it just lines up amazing, and it made perfect sense once I found out after the fact. Thankfully, he's already been arrested for this and probably won't be out anytime soon. While of course the victim's safety and the safety of anyone else potentially at risk of his actions is the main reason that's great, it also means he won't be putting out any music anytime soon, making this an even better conclusion. The only thing redeeming about Count Up Dracula is its pathetically small runtime of 14 minutes, making it a very quick listen. It's a funny bit of irony there, because while making the album even more pointless and substanceless, it actually makes listening to it a way less painful experience. So yeah, that's gotta be it. I am shocked that I didn't end up putting Falling in Reverse at the top spot. I had it there for a very long time, and anybody who's listened to the podcast or heard me talk about Falling in Reverse at all knows that it probably should have ended up there, and it definitely would have any other year. But yeah, that just about wraps it up for the bad music of 2024. If you'd like to hear more on this or the best music, I have other videos that are year-end lists. I'm not sure which ones are out at the time you're seeing this, but there is a best songs and a worst songs list out already at the time of me filming this. There's also 2 podcast episodes, one covering the worst music of the year, one covering the best music of the year, that you can go check out on the channel right now if that sounds interesting. But if you have liked what you saw here today, a like on the video would be greatly appreciated, and subscribing to the channel for more music-related content coming your way would also be greatly appreciated. That's just about going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.